A couple of weeks ago, it was announced that 155 Leaving Cert students from this year had their results withheld because they'd been found guilty of cheating. Now, no details were released about how they were supposedly cheating or how they were caught. And the officials have emphasised that this is a very small percentage of the something like 65,000 students who sat the exam. But still, it's a significant increase on the 71 students who were caught cheating last year. Now, none of us know why these students did that. But I think we understand the pressure that our Leaving Cert students are under to get into their preferred college course, or to avoid a sense of failure, to avoid disappointing parents, or even the wrong but widely held perception that this exam and the results of it will determine their future. But of course, the temptation to cheat is not limited just to students in Ireland. A couple of months ago, I read in the news in South Korea that a high school teacher and a student's mum were arrested after breaking into their school late at night to steal exam papers. And then in surveys in other countries have reported between 50 and 70% of students, college school students, admit to cheating throughout their academic career. So cheating in exams or in assessments is more common than we would like to think. But Daniel and his friends were different. As we saw last week, they faced a much more pressured situation than any Leaving Cert student or college student here. They were prisoners of war. They were taken from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. And now they were enrolled in college to train and to transform into Babylonians, working in the king's service. But despite all of the pressure on this, Daniel and his friends refused the temptation to cheat the system. In fact, they were willing to obey God, even if it put themselves at a disadvantage in that college system. And this is because they trusted in God. So we're going to have a look at this passage, Daniel chapter 1 again, as we follow on from last week. And we're going to read from verse 8 to 21. And Paul is going to come and he's going to read for us now. Thank you, Paul.
Daniel chapter 1 verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favour and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed you your meat and your drink. For why should he see the faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days. Let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eateth the portion of the king's meat, as you see, deal with your servants. So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat, and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all he found that none was like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding, that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus.
Thanks, Paul. So last week we saw how Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He made a firm decision that whatever it cost, he wouldn't compromise his beliefs. He went against the flow and put God first, even though it meant he had to stand against the powerful and evil King Nebuchadnezzar. But Daniel didn't go to the other extreme. As believers in Jesus, we face two kind of extreme temptations when it comes to our relationship with this world. One is to fit in with the world and just to try to become just like everybody else. But the other is to isolate ourselves from this world, to refuse to participate in it, to as far as possible cut ourselves off from everyone else who doesn't share our beliefs or standard. Either fit in with the world or isolate ourselves from this world. But Daniel here took the third option. Yes, he resolved not to eat of the king's food, because he knew that was against what God wanted. But he was still willing to be involved in this college program. That's why he approached Ashpenaz, the chief official, and made a very restricted request. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this matter, in this way. He knew that this college was run by people who were absolutely steeped in idolatry and wrong beliefs. But he didn't want to remove himself out of that. He was willing to listen and to learn and to study in this teaching program. He simply asked not to have to eat this allocated food. He was willing to train, to serve in this king's government, even though he didn't share this king's beliefs. To be involved in that society in Babylon, even though he wanted to hold on to his difference from it. And I think this was consistent with what God had told the exiles to do through the prophet Jeremiah. If you read Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 7, it says this. This is what the Lord said to them. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it. For if it prospers, you too will prosper. And that's similar to what Jesus has called us to do, if we've chosen to follow him. If you remember his prayer just before he went to the cross on that night, recorded in John chapter 17, was this. My prayer is not that you take them out of this world, but that you protect them from the evil one. Jesus wants us to be in this world, but not to be like this world. To contribute to this society. While at the same time being committed to following Jesus. Not to just be like the world, not to isolate ourselves from this world, but to be in this third option. In the world, but not like the world. Not to retreat from this dark and decaying world, but to be salt and light in it. To be a blessing to it. But Daniel's request here, it wasn't just restricted. was also quite respectful. Sometimes people can be really obnoxious and offensive in how they challenge people who don't share their own principles. I think we've seen this in the aftermath of the tragic murder of Charlie Kirk, from people on both sides of that ideological divide. The things that they've said about each other are pretty horrible at times. But Daniel was different. And we'll see that as we go through Daniel's life. He was not aggressive or arrogant. He didn't attack Ashpenaz or ridicule his beliefs. Instead, he just respectfully asked to be exempted from eating the king's food. Listen to what Peter taught us in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. Yes, we need to speak about Jesus and share the wonderful truth of who He is and what He calls us to. But we need to do this with gentleness and respect. Or if you remember when we were looking at the book of Ephesians, how we read how we should always be speaking the truth in love. Why should we do that? Well, because we have God's love in our hearts for people. We see the value of those people as we know that they're valued in God's sight. Despite the fact that they might hold to the beliefs that are ungodly or unbiblical, we still recognize their value and want to respect them. But I think it's also because we can trust that God is in control. Think about it for a minute. If the outcome of a situation totally depended on us, then we might be tempted to use every means possible to get what we want or what we need. We might push and push and push. We might even be tempted to use abusive or manipulative language or ridicule or all of those things just to make sure that we got our way. But if we believe that God is sovereign over our lives, and that ultimately what matters is what God desires and what God does, then we can address issues and deal with problems with peace, with patience, with grace. This is what Paul wrote. He said, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons that we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish arguments." Not using human weapons, but trusting that God will do His work. We can do what is right and leave the outcome in God's hands, because we believe that ultimately God is sovereign. Many are the plans in a man's heart, Proverbs 19 says, but it's the Lord's purpose that prevails. And I think we can see this at work in Daniel's life. Look at verse 9. God had caused the official to show favour and sympathy to Daniel. God could have burst into that situation in power and might. And He does that at times. But instead in this situation, he was at work in quiet, unassuming ways of just moving one man's heart to care for another guy. God was at work in this situation. But still, Ashpenaz refused Daniel's request. Did you see that in verse 10? I'm afraid of the Lord my King, who has assigned you food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you. God was at work, but this guy refused Daniel's request. It's a reminder, isn't it? That just because things are not going in the direction that we want, it doesn't mean that God's not at work. However our circumstances appear, however impossible our situation is, whether we can see God at work or not, we can rest in this promise that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. So Daniel had hit this roadblock. How would he respond? Well, he didn't lose his temper. He didn't panic. Neither did he just give up. Trusting in God's sovereignty doesn't mean we just sit back and don't do anything. Instead, Daniel, he approached his personal guard with a test, with the offer of a test. A clever test. That's because, first of all, this test was short. Look at verse 12. Please test your servants for 10 days. Now, this training program that Daniel had been enrolled in was for 3 years. So if the guard wasn't pleased with the result after 10 days, he could just go back to imposing the king's rule and the king's command, and nobody would be any the wiser. It was relatively risk-free for him. It was also a simple test. Verse 12. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. This vegetarian diet would mean that they wouldn't have to eat any of the food that had been sacrificed to pagan idols or that went against the Mosaic food laws that they'd been called to live under. But it was a simple test to initiate. Just feed them some vegetables and drink them water. But it was also a sure test. Verse 13, compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. This guard, this Babylonian guard, he wouldn't know the value of following God's laws. But he could just use his eyes to compare the appearance of those who were eating the extravagant diet of the king against Daniel and his 3 friends. It's a really clever plan. Short, simple, and sure. And because of that, this guy agreed to this test. Tested him for 10 days. I think this is the first of many times we'll see in this book the wisdom of Daniel. Daniel is an incredibly wise man, even as a young man. But as we'll see in a minute or two, this wasn't something that Daniel could take the credit for. This was a gift of God's grace. And it's the same for us. As we live for Jesus in this messed up world, we often will face situations that we just do not know what to do or how to respond. Loads of times. But look at what God has promised. James chapter 1 verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, and I'm sure all our hands will shoot up there, yeah. He should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. And it will be given him. What an incredible promise. However difficult our situation is, we can trust that God understands it completely. He knows how we should respond. He knows what we should be doing. And He can lead us in that way. And so the challenge is in Proverbs 3 and 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. And lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. This is what Daniel and his friends did. They trusted in God. And God worked in their lives. Look at verse 15. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Now let's be absolutely clear. This was not because of the benefit of a vegan diet or the value of drinking lots and lots of water. Please don't take this from this lesson. This is not teaching us that we should all go on the so-called Daniel fast. Okay? That's not what this passage is teaching at all. If you're a vegan, that's great. You enjoy your vegetables while we tuck into our meat. This was because God stepped in. This is because God stepped in and ensured that these young men were better nourished and were healthier than all the others. This was a God thing. This was not a biological thing. This was an example of the Mosaic covenant blessings that God had promised to Israel. Deuteronomy 28, all these blessings will come upon you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. The nation as a whole had been disobeying God. That's why they'd been taken into exile, or some of them had been taken into exile, and they were going that way for most of them. But here Daniel and his three friends were obeying God. And so instead of the curses of this covenant, they were receiving the blessings of this covenant. So the decision for the guard was simple. The guard took away the choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. He allowed Daniel and his friends to follow God's commands. In response to their faithfulness, God stepped in to do what seemed impossible. So that they could follow their God and still be safe from the king. As Merrill was reminding us, often we face situations that seem impossible for us to live for God. Maybe to overcome challenges in our lives. Maybe to think of, how can I follow Jesus in this situation? My situation, my life, my circumstances are so difficult that I just can't keep going. But Jesus said, what is impossible with men is possible with God. We can trust God. That when we commit our lives to Him, when we take our stand for Him, He will work in ways beyond what we can imagine. Not always in ways that we want, not always in ways that we think, but always in the best ways. But this 10-day test was not the last test that Daniel and his friends aced. At the end of the 3 years, each student was presented to King Nebuchadnezzar, an oral exam. And he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These 4 young, godly men impressed this evil, idolatrous king. They were wiser, better, more remarkable than all the others. In fact, the king said that he found that they were 10 times better than all his other advisors, those advisors who depended on the occult to work out what the king should do. And as a result, these 4 men entered the king's service. But again, we need to be careful how we respond to this, what we conclude from this. Because this was not because Daniel and his 3 friends were more naturally intelligent or gifted than the rest. And neither was it because they studied harder than the rest. The reason was because, verse 17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. This was because of God's gift to them. Something they couldn't earn or deserve. A gift of God's grace in their lives. And I think that's the real focus of this chapter. This is actually the 3rd time the little word says, God gave, is repeated in this chapter. It's in verse 2, verse 9, and in verse 17 here. God gave, God gave, God gave. So this chapter is not really about Nebuchadnezzar and what he did. And neither is it about Daniel and his friends and what they achieved. This chapter is about God. And how even in this exceptionally difficult time, God was present. And God was working. In unexpected ways, in maybe hidden ways, but God was working. He was accomplishing His purpose and His plan through His faithful people. These guys had taken a stand for God. They'd risked everything for Him, but in the end, they didn't lose out because God was at work. Honouring their commitment to Him, just as He had promised. Those who honour me, I will honour. So what does this mean for us today? Well, it doesn't mean that if we follow Jesus, then everything is going to be wonderful. We know that, don't we? It doesn't mean that we'll never fail an exam, never get into trouble, never face any problems, that we'll always look better and healthier than everybody else, and we'll always be the top of the class. And it doesn't mean all of that. We'll see even in Daniel's life and his friend's life, as we go through this book, that it didn't mean that for them either. They faced some really tough times in their lives. But it does mean that no matter what the circumstances or troubles we experience, if we put our faith in Jesus as our Saviour and our Lord, then we can trust that God is with us. And that He is at work in our lives. And that God is able to make all grace abound to you. So that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. We might face situations in our lives that are beyond what we can do. That go beyond our resources, our strength, our power, our insight, our understanding. But our need will never exhaust God's grace. God's grace will always be more than enough. And so whether we can see this reality in our lives or not right now, honouring God is always worth it. Ultimately, we will discover that God has always been working for our good. That whatever it has cost us to follow Jesus, we have not lost out. We have gained far more than we've had to give up. And it's this long-term view that this chapter ends with. Did you notice? Look at verse 21. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. King Cyrus came after this powerful king Nebuchadnezzar had died. Even after his whole Babylonian empire had fallen and been taken over. But even after all of that, by God's grace, Daniel was still there, serving his God right into his 80s. Why did the author fast forward this to this point in this chapter? He's going to get there a little bit. We're going to read through it and through the chapters, little episodes from his life. But why does he fast forward right here? I think it's to remind us, it's supposed to set us up, create this expectation for something that we're going to see develop much more in this book. The earthly kingdoms will come and will go. But God's kingdom and God's people, they will endure forever. Listen how Psalm 1 concludes. The Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. That's the confidence that we can have. We might see success in our lives in this life on earth. Or we might not. We might see God at work in the short term or in the medium term of our lives. But we can be absolutely sure that in the long term, from an eternal perspective, we will never lose out. Following Jesus will always be worth it. As Treve reminded us a few weeks ago, our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. That's why Daniel and his friends didn't need to cheat the system. That's why they could trust in God, despite how difficult their situation was. Because ultimately, God was with them, and He was working by His grace for their ultimate good. Giving them the courage to make this request. Giving them the wisdom to devise this clever test. Giving them the health and the understanding to succeed in a clear result. Giving them the endurance to keep on faithfully serving in this continuing role. And we can follow in their footsteps. Whatever challenges we face, we can trust in God. To give us all that we need to follow Jesus, to put Him first in our lives, to obey His commands. Knowing that in all that we experience, God is at work in our lives. That He is working for our eternal good and for His glory.